the elements of an effective emergency response plan. We've gone over prevention and the people factor and priorities, and we're going to see how this kind of all comes together. Okay, basically I'm going to go over these parts of the plan rather briefly. These are generally what's covered in your Getty volume, and of course, you know, the Getty book by no means is a kind of one-size-fits-all. You really either have to adapt it to your institution. If it's much smaller, you know, there may not be any need of it. But the plan essentially goes, has the components of, you know, an introduction or, you know, basic instructions to how the emergency teams are set up. How do you contact people in emergency in your own area? What are some of the guidelines that are followed in terms of evacuation? Which things are really prioritized that you go after? Elements in terms of collection salvage, where supplies are stored, and also goes over training and setting up a review schedule. Very briefly, the policy statement really is the introduction to your guide. It essentially is a summary of what's going to be covered in the plan and what or really who was involved in the creation. Now, as I mentioned, there needs, whoever is the director of your organization needs to develop a group of people who are most qualified to help organize the staff and involve all of them in preparedness before disaster takes place and response as well. Everyone needs to be involved. It's important for everyone to feel a buy-in as well. It also helps to enhance the planning effort and staff morale. And part of it, of course, are covering, you know, what are the risks and priorities in there. The basic team, which you should have really in any organization, is an emergency team. And this is a group that's involved with setting up priorities for what you're going to protect before disaster takes place and recovery. Some kind of program for reviewing the plan annually, as well as looking over your building logs to see whether there are any kind of, you know, issues remaining, or how did you work through that the first time. But another important thing about the team is they need to be prepared and qualified to respond, and this is where disaster training workshops and drills are really important. Now, this is, again, kind of a not a one-size-fits-all, but it's sort of the Getty listing of what an emergency team can be comprised of. You certainly do want to have some response team leader, but there's also a whole series of coordinators who are involved with assessing any of the damage to the materials or the collection. One in charge of going through the salvage process. Another involved in communicating with the people in the team, but also others maybe in your organization. Someone certainly handling finance and administration, health and safety, and technology. But an important part of an emergency team is you're going to have volunteers likely as well. And these again are people that may not be as familiar as you are with some of the collections in your institution, so you want to pay particular attention to their training. In addition to the response team, there really should be an emergency contact list or a telephone tree. This is an example of one from our science library, where there are each of these people that should be contacted in the event of an emergency. I mean, you could set up a pattern where one would, try to reach the other, or someone, need to try to reach all of these people. but that's another important list. In your plan, you also need to have some kind of a list of the different kinds of hazards that we talked about earlier that can occur at the facility. And these things can consist of anything from fires to flooding, power failures, typically in Florida here, hurricanes, severe storms, and somewhat more recently in the last few years, workplace violence and issues with an active shooter are very much part of that. In addition to dealing with these different emergencies, you also have people who are, probably the most important factor. The people, your staff, your visitors, your clients. So you need to have some guidelines in place for evacuating them from the building. And this is where you need to communicate well with your emergency responders, police, fire, others in your organization, or if it's a campus. Then you need to have some kind of plans for these different threats. What is it you're going to do when some of these threats of an impending disaster take place? And they really should all be based on what you've listed in the plan. So, for example, flooding or water damage is very common here. You may have some guidelines anywhere from as simple as notifying the supervisor in charge to some other things that may be common sense or maybe not necessarily common sense, like don't walk in standing water. You want to try to do whatever you can to avoid immediate water damage, and maybe covering the shelf range with plastic sheeting, which at least could be a temporary measure, and be able to move things out of range where they could be damaged. As we talked about earlier, you need to set up priorities in your institution, whether it's a museum, a library, archives, a living museum, historical society. Identify what's a high priority material, items that are maybe particularly irreplaceable, unique, heavily used. Second priority may be your basic collection materials, what sort of forms the core of it, and your lower priority items, which would be things that if they were damaged, you could get them, they could be replaced in another format, or maybe things that are not very heavily used or really don't have a great deal of value. I mean, it's definitely a great time to be able to do some weeding at that point. Well, communication is another important thing that you have, and there's a lot of communication involved in a disaster. You need to be able to communicate with the response team, but also the outside world. Your administrators, contractors, the emergency responders, the media, and you want to keep staff informed about the disaster as well. And very often you may have someone who's deals with the media that would be helpful to have in terms of getting information to them. In addition to communication, you need to keep paper trails. The documentation is really important. We've kind of gone over the factors there. It's important for insurance claims or proof of loss if you're trying to get assistance, perhaps through FEMA or another organization. It may also be used for future fundraising. There may be something that was really important to your collections that should be replaced, and also may be able to help with any kind of media coverage of the event. If you have documentation as well, it helps you maybe when you're updating the plan to establish salvage priorities. Helps to review after the disaster has taken place, how did we handle things? Could it have been done better? Many places call this sort of like a post-mortem analysis. and it also can be helpful in keeping track of staff needs and how much time is used up. Salvage and recovery are one of the last but really important elements in the plan, and we've talked about salvage, and that's really going after your damaged collections, at least as best as you can. I mean, if you and there again, you have to kind of weigh the issue of, depending on what's happening, you need to leave right away, or if you've got things protected as well. But salvage work really should be done very systematically. People can be really panicky at this kind of point, but you should already have your collection priorities nailed down. I'm not going to go over all of these, but some of the ones involved in salvage work are certainly instructing your staff. You should have some priorities in place. Another step, which I know Getty goes into and others, is to triage them. In other words, kind of sort everything into what you're going to look at. First, assign people to work with materials that are damaged, maybe to start packing things up if you're working with a contractor that's involved with freeze drying, or if you are lucky enough to have freezer facilities, get things ready for that. But always it's important to keep documentation. And when you get into disaster recovery workshops, they go over that in a lot more detail. Supplies are certainly important. You need to know and be checking your plan annually to see what supplies and equipment you have on hand. If not, you want to check, but not at the time of a threatening storm, for example. Go out to home improvement stores, office supply shops, to be able to get those supplies, and you might, if you can, put them somewhere near areas that are, more priority locations. If you need more, then there should be a leader or coordinator with the response team that helps you out. But you do want to arrange some kind of secure location for them. And another important part of this is, and this is part of reviewing your plan, is if you are working with contractors here, be sure to review the terms, everything that they will do, what you're covered for, and just continue to monitor everything. And then your supplies and equipment coordinator is probably the one that can help out the most, or someone that you designate in terms of looking for additional supplies. But you also should have a list of suppliers on hand when you get into an emergency. For those folks here in Tallahassee, I have a sample of the university library's plan for the main library, and also a listing of supplies. And we may go ahead and post that as well to the community site, so others can look at that. Most importantly, too, in addition to carrying out these procedures, is training. Guidance and support need to be provided. Everyone who's serving on your response team should be sure that they get trained in the knowledge and skills about how to handle materials, either dealing with books, media, recordings, archival materials. Also know about the kinds of, there are some supplies that you can get that have materials in there for dealing with these things. You want to keep it up to date, regularly conduct drills, debriefings, and training sessions. Importance of training is it helps foster a sense of teamwork, good morale. Again, like everything else with these groups, you want to involve all the staff and practice all of these elements too. And then finally, you need to have some kind of review schedule for annually reviewing the emergency and response plan, as well as the priorities for protection and recovery, because your priorities may change usually from year to year depending on different circumstances.